The Titanic didn't just sink, something was removed with it. Documents, names, and entire records, not destroyed, erased, and once you see what's missing, you'll never believe the official story again. A night the world remembers, but doesn't understand. April 14, 1912. The coldest night in the North Atlantic. More than 2,200 people aboard the most famous ship ever built. Luxury, confidence, power. The Titanic was called unsinkable. But that wasn't the biggest lie, because while the world remembers how Titanic sank, almost no one asks what disappeared with it. The first strange gap. In the days after the disaster, newspapers were flooded with stories. Survivor interviews, crew testimonies, official reports. But historians later noticed something disturbing. Some names appeared, then vanished. Some testimonies were recorded, then removed. Some documents were referenced. But no copies exist today, not lost in the ocean, not burned in a fire, just gone. Too many changes to be an accident. Early survivor accounts described a calm sea, a visible object ahead, confusion on the bridge. But later versions quietly changed details. Words were softened, timelines adjusted, responsibility blurred. Why? Because when records change after the fact, it usually means someone is trying to protect something. The question nitrogen monoxide one likes asking: what if the Titanic disaster wasn't just a tragedy? What if it was also a failure hidden behind hero stories? A mistake buried under official language, a truth rewritten before the ink could dry? And what if some records were never meant to survive at all? We'll look at the warnings that were sent to Titanic, the ones acknowledged, and the ones that mysteriously vanished. Because the iceberg wasn't the first warning, it was the last. The warnings that vanished. The Titanic didn't hit the iceberg by surprise. It was warned, again, and again, and again. But some warnings were never read, some were ignored, and some disappeared. The first warning. Days before Titanic ever struck the iceberg, ships crossing the North Atlantic were sending wireless messages. Ice ahead, danger zones, floating ice fields. These were not rumors. They were clear, direct warnings, and Titanic received them. So the question isn't did they know? The question is, why didn't they slow down? Too many messages to ignore. On April 14, 1912, the day Titanic sank, multiple ice warnings were sent. Some were logged, some were acknowledged. But historians later noticed something strange. Not all warning messages appear in the final records. Some messages are mentioned by survivors, but missing from official transcripts. As if they were never meant to be found. The message that changed everything. One particular warning described heavy ice, large icebergs, direct path ahead. According to early accounts, this message reached Titanic's wireless room. But later investigations barely mention it. No full text. No timestamp, no explanation, just a reference, and then silence. A deadly confidence. Titanic did not slow down. Why? Some say, pressure to arrive early, reputation, overconfidence in technology. But what if it was simpler? What if they believed nothing could happen? And when things went wrong, the warnings became inconvenient. When history is written by survivors, after the sinking, stories were told by those who lived. But the dead told no stories, and when messages are missing, details change, responsibility shifts, history stops being a record, and becomes a version. We'll look at the ship itself, the design they praised, the flaws they denied, and the truth about a ship that was never meant to sink. Because sometimes, the danger isn't outside the ship. It's built into it. The ship that was never meant to sink. They called it unsinkable. Not because it was tested, but because they believed it. Titanic didn't fail because of the ocean. It failed because of decisions made long before it ever sailed. and once you see how the ship was truly built, you'll understand why sinking was never impossible. The myth of unsinkable. Before Titanic ever touched the sea, it already had a reputation. Newspapers praised it. Investors trusted it. Passengers believed it. The word unsinkable spread faster than facts. But here's the truth. Titanic was never officially tested to be unsinkable. It was a belief, a marketing idea, a promise people wanted to hear, and promises can be dangerous. A design that looked perfect on paper. Titanic's design impressed everyone. Watertight compartments, advanced engineering, size never seen before. But size created a problem. The ship was too large, and its internal structure depended on assumptions, not certainties. The compartments were meant to stop flooding. But there was one detail rarely discussed. They did not extend high enough. Water didn't need to break walls. It simply went over them. Like pouring water into connected cups, a safety system with a fatal limit. Engineers believed 2 compartments flooding equals safe. 3 compartments flooding equals survivable. 4 compartments flooding equals disaster. That night, more than 4 were breached. Not because the ship was weak, but because the design never imagined a long tear. The iceberg didn't punch holes, it opened seams. A scenario the designers never prepared for. Overconfidence, the real enemy. The ship was modern. The technology was new. And with new technology comes confidence. Too much confidence. Titanic sailed faster than it should have. Warnings felt unnecessary. Precautions felt outdated. Why? Because when people believe something cannot fail, they stop preparing for failure. And when failure comes, there is no plan. The lifeboat question. One of the most disturbing truths. Titanic did not carry enough lifeboats. Not because of lack of space, not because of ignorance, but because more boats would block the view. Regulations were outdated. The ship was believed to be safe. They followed the law, not common sense, and the law had not kept up with reality. When design meets denial. After the disaster, questions were asked. Why were lifeboats limited? Why were speed and warnings ignored? Why were design flaws downplayed? But answers were softened. Blame shifted, language changed, responsibility blurred. Because admitting design failure would mean the ship was never as safe as claimed. And that truth was expensive. A failure built over time. Titanic did not sink in one night. It sank through assumptions, confidence, compromises, silence. By the time it hit the iceberg, the outcome was already written. We'll look at the people who were supposed to be on Titanic, but never boarded. Powerful names, last-minute cancellations, unexplained decisions, because sometimes the most important part of the story is who wasn't there. The people who never boarded. More than 2,200 people boarded the Titanic, but some of the most powerful names never did. Last-minute cancellations, sudden excuses, quiet decisions. And when you look at who stayed behind, you begin to wonder, did they know something the others didn't? Empty cabins. Titanic was fully booked. First class was packed with wealth, influence, and power. Yet, on the night of departure, some luxury cabins remained empty. No public announcement, no explanation. Just names removed from passenger lists. Last-minute cancellations. Records show that several passengers cancelled hours before departure, changed plans suddenly, offered vague reasons, illness, business delays, personal matters. But historians noticed something strange. These cancellations were unusually well-timed. Coincidence? Or instinct? Individually, a cancelled ticket means nothing. But together, patterns begin to form. Multiple people, connected by power, finance, or influence, decided not to board. No warning sent, no memo shared. Just decisions, made in silence. The power of information. In 1912, information moved slowly. But some people always knew more than others. They had private conversations, insider access, early reports. And when someone has information others don't, they act quietly. Not dramatically, silently. Names that raised questions. After the sinking, journalists noticed something disturbing. Certain influential figures were expected aboard, publicly associated with the voyage, suddenly absent. Their absence was never highlighted. No headlines, no investigation. History simply moved on. Survival by absence. Everyone talks about survival stories. But what about survival by not being there at all? Those people faced no lifeboats, heard no screams, felt no cold. They survived the Titanic without ever boarding it. The quiet privilege of choice. Most passengers had no choice. They booked tickets months earlier. They trusted the ship. They trusted the promise. But powerful people had something others didn't: options. And when danger feels possible, options become lifelines. Why history never pushed harder? After the disaster, investigations focused on crew actions, ship design, lifeboats, but they never asked who chose not to board, and why. Because asking that question would mean questioning influence, questioning privilege, questioning silence. And silence was easier. What if they knew nothing? To be fair, maybe they knew nothing. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe fate played its role. But history isn't built on certainty. It's built on questions. And this question still remains unanswered. We'll hear from the people who survived. The ones who spoke, then changed their stories. Because some testimonies didn't just fade, they were rewritten. And when witnesses change their words, it's never without a reason. The testimonies are changed. Survivors are supposed to tell the truth. But what if the truth changes? What if the same witness tells one story today and another tomorrow? On the Titanic, some testimonies didn't fade with time. They were changed. The voices that survived. When the Titanic sank, more than 1,500 voices were lost forever. Only a few hundred survived to tell the story. Their words became history. Their memories became evidence. And their testimonies shaped what the world would believe. The first stories. In the hours and days after the disaster, survivors spoke freely. They were shaken, cold, traumatized. Their early accounts described confusion on the bridge, mixed commands, delayed responses. These were raw memories, unfiltered and emotional. Then, the changes began. As days passed, something strange happened. Some survivors softened their words, removed details, changed timelines. Statements became cleaner, more careful, less accusatory. It was subtle, but it was real. Memory doesn't change that fast. Trauma can affect memory. But historians noticed something important. The changes weren't random. They followed a pattern. Responsibility shifted away from decisions, authority, systems, and toward fate, nature, the iceberg. As if the story was being guided. Official inquiries, unofficial pressure. Survivors were called to testify. Questions were asked, notes were taken, records were written. But not every testimony was treated equally. Some witnesses were questioned deeply. Others briefly, some not at all. And some statements were never entered into final reports. The silence between words, what's missing from history, is often louder than what remains. In Titanic records, pauses are ignored, contradictions are smoothed. Follow-up questions disappear. Silence became a tool. Because silence doesn't accuse anyone. Why would a witness change the story? There are many reasons: fear, pressure, loyalty, survival. In 1912, power mattered. Speaking against authority could cost jobs, reputation, safety. So some witnesses chose safety over truth. The official version emerges. Over time, one version of events became dominant. It was simple, clean, easy to accept. The Titanic hit an iceberg. Mistakes were made, lessons were learned. But this version left no room for deeper failure, human decisions, preventable outcomes. And once a version becomes official, other versions disappear. History isn't always a lie. But it is a choice. History isn't always written to deceive. Sometimes it's written to protect. Protect institutions. Protect reputations. Protect stability. But protection comes at a cost. The cost is truth. We'll look at the investigation itself, the reports that were published, and the pages that were missing. Because when an investigation avoids certain questions, it stops being an investigation. It becomes a cover. The investigation with missing pages. After the Titanic sank, the world demanded answers. An investigation was launched. But what if the investigation itself was incomplete? What if some questions were never meant to be asked, and some answers were never meant to be written? The world demands the truth. The Titanic disaster shocked the world. Governments were under pressure. Families wanted justice. Newspapers demanded accountability. Doing nothing was not an option. So, investigations were announced, publicly, confidently, and officially. 2 investigations, 1 narrative. 2 major inquiries were launched, 1 in the United States, 1 in Britain. Different countries, different systems, but strangely, they reached almost the same conclusions. That alone raised eyebrows. What an investigation is supposed to do. A real investigation follows evidence, challenges authority, asks uncomfortable questions. But Titanic inquiries felt different. They focused heavily on the iceberg, weather conditions, passenger behavior, and lightly on command decisions, system failures, corporate responsibility, questions that were never asked. Some obvious questions were avoided. Why were speed warnings ignored? Why were lifeboat drills cancelled? Why were binoculars missing? These weren't conspiracy questions. They were basic safety questions, yet they were brushed aside. The missing pages. Researchers later noticed something strange. Some records end abruptly, jump in timeline, refer to documents that no longer exist. Certain testimonies were summarized, not transcribed, and summaries are powerful, because whoever writes them controls meaning. Language that protects, not reveals. The wording of official reports mattered. Phrases like, unavoidable accident, act of nature, no clear negligence. These phrases end discussion. Close responsibility, public outrage. Language didn't search for truth. Language managed perception. The role of power. The Titanic was not just a ship. It represented industrial pride, corporate ambition, national image. Admitting deeper failures would damage reputations, trust, economic confidence. So the system did what systems do best. It protected itself. What happens when history is rushed? The inquiries moved fast. Too fast. Before, full recovery, full analysis, full reflection. Closing the case quickly meant fewer questions, less pressure, easier acceptance. And once a case is closed, it rarely reopens. Truth doesn't disappear. It waits. Truth doesn't vanish. It hides, in contradictions, in footnotes, in ignored details. Decades later, historians began noticing inconsistencies, patterns, repeated omissions. The Titanic story wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. We'll examine the final hours before impact, the warnings that were received, the choices that were made, and the minutes that decided everything. Because the Titanic didn't sink only because of an iceberg. It sank because of decisions. The final warnings. The Titanic was warned. Not once, not twice, but again and again. The iceberg didn't appear suddenly. It was announced. It was reported. It was ignored. Morse code beeps fade into silence. The Atlantic was talking. In April 14th, 1912, the North Atlantic was alive with messages. Wireless operators across ships were warning each other. Ice fields ahead. Large bergs drifting south. Unusual cold waters. The ocean was sending signals. The question was simple. Who was listening? Message after message. Throughout the day, Titanic received multiple ice warnings. Some were polite. Some were urgent. Some were direct. One message clearly stated, icebergs, growlers, and field ice directly in your path. This wasn't vague. This was a map written in words. Time was running out. As evening approached, the temperature dropped sharply. Experienced sailors knew what that meant. Calm sea. No waves. Ice becomes invisible, the most dangerous condition for navigation. Still, Titanic did not slow down. Speed over safety. Titanic was moving fast, too fast. Why? Because speed meant headlines, reputation, proof of engineering confidence. Slowing down meant admitting risk, and risk didn't fit the narrative of an unsinkable ship. The warning that annoyed someone. One nearby ship sent a final warning. It was blunt, it was urgent. But it arrived when Titanic's wireless operators were busy sending passenger messages. The warning was received, and then dismissed. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was inconvenient. A lookout in the dark, high above the deck. The lookout scanned the black ocean. No binoculars, no moonlight, no waves to break ice outlines. Just darkness, and then a shape, too close, too late. The moment everything changed, the alarm was sounded, commands were shouted. The ship turned, but physics doesn't negotiate. The iceberg scraped along the hull, quietly, almost politely. No explosion, no dramatic crash, just a long, deadly wound. Confusion on the bridge. Officers debated. Some believed the ship was fine. Others weren't sure. The damage wasn't visible, and denial is powerful, especially when pride is involved. Precious minutes were lost. The ocean enters the story. Water doesn't rush. It invades, slowly at first, silently, then faster, then unstoppable. By the time certainty arrived, so had fate. We'll witness the chaos, the evacuation, the lifeboats, the decisions of who lived and who was left behind. Because the greatest tragedy of the Titanic was not the iceberg, it was what happened after.
The night of chaos. When the Titanic began to sink, there was no panic at first, no screams, no rush, because the most dangerous moment is when people still believe everything will be fine. Soft orchestra note breaks suddenly into silence. Denial before death. After the iceberg strike, many passengers didn't feel fear. The ship was still, warm, bright, steady. Some laughed, some joked, some went back to bed. They trusted the ship, and that trust was fatal. Time was wasted. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Crew members debated. How serious is it? Should we wake everyone? Should we lower lifeboats now? Every delay cost lives, but panic was avoided at the price of urgency. Lifeboats, the great failure. Titanic carried lifeboats, but not enough. Why? Because rules were outdated, because confidence replaced caution, because unsinkable didn't plan for sinking. More than half the people on board never had a seat. Who gets to live? Women and children first. It sounds noble, but on that night, it was unclear. It was uneven. It was enforced differently. Some boats left half empty, while hundreds waited, watching salvation float away. Class determined fate. Not everyone reached the decks equally. First-class passengers had guidance.
When the screaming stopped, when the ocean became quiet, and the Titanic disappeared beneath the surface. The world thought the story was over. It wasn't. For the survivors, this was only the beginning. Morning after the end. Dawn arrived quietly. No music, no lights, no ship. Just debris and bodies. The ocean was calm again, as if nothing had happened. The rescue that came too late. Rescue ships arrived. They found lifeboats drifting, survivors frozen in shock, silence where screams once lived. But for most, help arrived hours too late. The sea had already decided. Survivors without relief. Survival didn't bring peace. It brought guilt, nightmares, questions. Many survivors asked themselves, "Why me?" And no answer ever felt right. The weight of silence. On rescue ships, people barely spoke. Some stared into nothing. Some cried quietly. Some couldn't cry at all. Silence wasn't calm, it was heavy. The world reacted. News spread fast. Headlines screamed tragedy. Photos were printed. Stories were told. But newspapers focused on numbers, famous names, sensational details, not on system failure, ignored warnings, preventable choices, bodies, burials, and forgotten names. Ships were sent to recover bodies. Some were identified, many were not. Children,